So, yeah, part 2, Mystery Among the Gentiles. Okay, fantastic. So you can see from the framework, we're looking roughly today at from 44, which is where we sort of finished last time, up to 57. So a kind of quick review from last week, just to set context. We the end of last time. Oh yes, that's right. Okay, we're gonna unpack this a little bit more this week, but much more so next week. We're going to really look at some of the dynamics. But we're going to see a little bit tonight how the Hellenized Jews were going to play quite a key role, and it's one that's often not fully. I think is not fully appreciated. I started to get an inkling of it some years back, but it's really kind of hit me more, particularly in preparing this sort of sessions. So we saw how it was Hellenized Jews. They'd returned from the day of Pentecost, so that their Jews spread out all over the empire. They'd come down to Jerusalem. They were there on the day of Pentecost. They had a sign, had a miraculous sign of hearing in their own language. They respond to the gospel, but the gospel is not quite so formulated as we would think of it today. At the time, it is that the disciples know that God has acted in Jesus, and they have come to recognize he's not only the Messiah, but there's something divine there's something of the divine in his nature. It's going to take over 200 years for the church to fully develop the kind of concept of the Trinity. Some of you be aware that the early church used the phrase the perichoresis of God, the dancing aroundness of God, because they saw God in Jesus, they saw God in the Holy Spirit, they saw God as the Father and Creator, and they thought, how does all of this work? So if you imagine on the day of Pentecost, those things doctrinally are not fully worked out. God has acted, they know they've been witness to something, they see the direction it's pointing, but they haven't really got it. And so similarly, those who are responding to something that is moving them in the Spirit. There's a sign because they've heard it in their own language. As they listen, there's something that feels true to them, but they haven't really worked it all out. And as time is going to go by, people have to start moving back to their own home towns and home places, of course. So they go back and they carry the experience they've gone through right the way out throughout the empire. So we saw then, of course, how then those as they're staying around there and the numbers in Jerusalem are growing, and how it sort of spills out into Judea, just as Jesus said, through Judea and then Samaria, and then to cities beyond. So within that year, and when Paul is heading up to Damascus, where he's searching within a year by 34 AD, Paul is looking for Christians in Damascus. Damascus, of course, is up in Syria, but it's one of the closest major cities, where some of those outside of Judea, which would have been full of the Jews who were there at Pentecost, experienced something, gone back. They've gone back. There's no apostles that we're aware of that have gone with them, but Paul's pursuing them at that point. And then we found out how, as they kind of work through Samaria and Judea, then as they come to Caesarea, which is on the coast of Judea. But Caesarea is a very major Roman town, Caesarea Maritima. There's a couple of Caesareas across the empire. And when Paul is there, he has that experience with Cornelius, and they get the revelation that it's okay to eat fully with the Gentiles. And that's a brand new thing. So it's very much a sense of the Gentiles coming into their homes and eating with them. Although in Peter's case, that was his big shock. He'd gone to the house of Cornelius to eat there. And so it's a model that they can kind of work where there's a Hellenistic influence, because the Hellenists are not a single unit. They don't all think the same. They're defined by their experience. The fact that, of course, they were part of the part of Israel that were taken off into dispersal. They've been moved around as communities by various empires that have come along, and administrations, and communities have been put here, communities have been put there. There are Jewish communities that have formed because Jews have been conscripted into the armies of various empires who then go off to conquer somewhere. So Alexandria was actually a kind of a Jewish majority, or an Israeli majority kind of army that was involved in taking Alexandria on behalf of Alexander. And so when he founded the city, it was in Jesus' day, it's still about 40% Jewish. So they've spread out all over the place. And in that context, some have got very secularized with the communities around them, and others have have become very kind of clear of their distinctions, but are very friendly with those around them. And they've developed a kind of a range of experiences of what we think of as God-fearers. We read about them in the... So there are proselytes, people who have gone through circumcision and fully adopted and become Jewish from the worlds and the Gentiles they're living amongst. There are God-fearers who they kind of communicate with, they invite to the festivals, but on their terms. And then there are also Hellenist Jews who have become so influenced by the culture around them. A bit like we meet many of Jesus's disciples, for instance, have got Greek names. Although none of them have the name of a Greek god or another local god, that's not at all uncommon. You actually find Hellenic Jews who have kind of become so integrated that they've got the name of a demigod or some other kind of spiritual character. So you've got questions about how far have they gone that direction. And then of course you get people who intermarry. And so there are a lot of people like Timothy, who of course we meet in the book of Acts, with Greek father, Jewish mother, and he then decides to kind of go through circumcision to identify more with his Jewish heritage. So it's a very mixed up influence, and we're going to see it plays a key role. We'll look at it even more next week. As we said at the end of last week, there's the church in Antioch. Lucius or Luke is probably one of the original founders, one of the men of Cyrene who's gone up there. Cyprus and Cyrene. Barnabas is from Cyprus, so he's gone, but he wasn't there in the initial wave. Paul, they're all part of the leadership team of that church up in Antioch at the moment. And there's been significant numbers of Greek converts now coming into the church at Antioch. So we have a model in the house of Cornelius that opened a door. Something is made of that in Antioch. And then, of course, similarly, Peter has a similar experience up in Rome. Although there's a Jewish community in Rome, and he's worked into them. We know from the reading of the early church fathers, we saw that there were members of the Praetorian Guard, members of Caesar's household, who are exposed to the teaching of Peter, and they in particular are those who've asked and commissioned Mark to write those experiences down in Greek so they can read them. So it started to highlight this tension. We've gone through Judea and Samaria, and that's really kind of a family context, kind of immediate family and second cousins or whatever in Samaria, but they are very close in. But this new work is going to ask some more questions, and we're going to have to find some new answers as we're going through. So we saw that list last week as to where folks had come from. I've added a couple of extra towns on there, Edessa and Antioch, where we now have, and Bithynia, which weren't part of the list, but we saw last week people being sent to those locations. So here you go. Here's our central little bit. So that was a nice little animation, wasn't it? What I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here. Let's go full screen, and I'll get rid of me. So look at that. I'm so professional when it comes to using PowerPoint. So here this area is not the extent of where the gospel is going to go to, but even by the time we finish, this is really where the powerhouse is going to develop. And there's something about this area, and as it stretches out, where there has been a very clear preparation which allows not just, if you like, a foothold for the gospel to make it into world history, but it's a bit like in Genesis, where it says, God gives all of the earth to mankind, says have dominion over it and so on. And then he plants a garden and says, start there. This is like the garden that God has already planted and says to the church, start here. If you think of it in those kinds of ways. So we're going to kind of see this next wave, and I called it Mystery Among the Gentiles because we're beginning to get the crossover. Although it's not as hard and fast a line as we might think. So after Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, we're going to see this is the right time, as Romans 5:6 puts it. At the right time he sends forth his son. In that what we're going to find is that there is a field that's ripe for harvest, and there is one that's ready for planting. And in one sense, that sphere that I just put up is going to be, we're going to see, is the place that is really ripe for planting. If it comes to really hardcore missions, people are getting saved who are a real big distance away and for whom conversion is a proper word to use, in the sense of they're going to have to change their social context, they're going to have to change everything about the way they see the world and so on. But there's this field that is ripe for the gospel. And we're going to fully explore that dynamic a bit more next week, but I'm going to introduce some things tonight. And that Hellenization has been key. And if you say that Hellenization has been key, we have to go back a step, and therefore we say the exile is key, which of course is something the Old Testament says. They can't understand. God, you wanted a temple, we built you a temple. You gave us all these rules which can only be fulfilled if we've got a temple. Now the temple's been destroyed and we're all in exile. What's going wrong? And God's saying, I've travelled with you, I've gone with you. There's something to do out here. And so then, of course, Israel comes back, and actually what we're going to see is this is probably the purpose of the exile. Because it was those layers of exiles followed by the different administrations of the empires that have moved and kind of fertilized the ground ready for the gospel to come in various different ways. And so one of the things we discover, and this is kind of work that is not opinion work, it's been, I could give you very boring statistical tables, which I pulled from this book here, Cities of God, which is by a sociologist historian, who's written a lot on Christianity through the ages and generations and so on. But he's very much of the view if you find something to measure and then you can kind of produce a theory. And one of the things he really shows is the way, for instance, in which that Hellenization process has modified the paganism. And so it modifies paganism and makes it more henotheistic. So what does that mean? So henotheism is a sort of step down from pure monotheism. So the difference, okay, I'll give it a quick background. I'll try not to spend too long on this, but about 500 BC, about the same time that the first waves are getting taken off into exile, and of course Israel has come out of Egypt, and out of Egypt there is a kind of, as paganism has got so many gods, it gets very confusing, and those who are in rulership and authority look for something that starts to simplify it a bit. And so actually around 500 BC, the Serapis kind of mythology develops in Egypt, which then in Greek thinking there was the kind of the idea of God as first mover or God as essence. So you get a very theoretical abstract sense of God. The Apis bull, which is part of the Serapis cult, comes to prominence. The Apis bull is seen as the place where the creator God lives. He doesn't do very much, doesn't communicate. He's so different from us we can't really know him, but he lives in the Apis bull. But then he has a representative within this. And so in Egypt it becomes what's his name? I can't remember the male name, but eventually it becomes Isis. So Isis, who was just one of many gods, starts to rise in prominence and becomes, if you like, the touch point of all of the gods, and is the kind of supreme goddess. And all prayers and all things in some way work back to her, and she administrates them amongst all of the other gods and sits at that highest point. So you have a kind of a supreme god amongst other smaller gods, whereas monotheism has a creator god, and while it can have other ranks of spiritual beings like angels and demons, they are not of the same nature. See, so there's a kind of a dividing line there. But what you find is that where there's strong Hellenization, the paganism philosophically starts to move towards henotheism. So you get actually the spreading and developing alongside and by the influence of Judaism, these kind of more henotheistic forms of paganism. And at the same time, then what you find is that the practices of those religions starts to change. It becomes more, particularly in the East, it becomes more emotionally engaging of the communities around them. So typically paganism was just about providing providing kind of a meeting point. It doesn't have necessarily communities, and occasionally some of these modified henotheistic paganisms start to try and develop a communities around them. And so they try to develop some sense of scripture around them. But what you found is that as people got involved and they found that more satisfying than the kind of total free-for-all of paganism, then they would notice that actually the influence was coming from Judaism, and Judaism has a slightly better structure. It's kind of intellectually more satisfying, and actually they have rituals and they have scripture as well. But the difference is the scripture, say for instance about Isis, well, we all know it's myth and it comes from various sources, whereas the stories that the Jewish religion is based around is about the God of creation acting into their history, and so their scriptures make more sense. And so there is there's a big process going on. Similarly, in those communities, and what we actually find is that the very nature that put the Jews there in the first place and brought other groups in from other places with their various pagan roots, found that they were much more open to talking to each other and dealing with each other and being open to new ideas. So you've got a kind of a smorgasbord of things going on here, which are actually going to provide and prove to be very useful for the spreading of the gospel. Now, these things have been known for a long time. Sadly, a lot of Christian churches reacted against them because what they didn't want to hear was how similar, for instance, ISIS. Let's take another one. Let's take Cybele. So Cybele, who's referred to the mother of the gods, and clearly she's very well respected within Rome, and clearly you can see elements of sort of Roman Catholic Mariolatry within some of the structure of that, and people would say, oh, it's just borrowed, and there's nothing new in Christianity, it was just borrowed from all these other places. Whereas actually right from the early church days, early church writers saw it the other way around. They saw that God had prepared the ground for them. And that was the view I was always brought up in. So that's what makes sense to me, that God had been preparing the ground. And because actually it's culturally much easier if you've got something that looks like something they understand and saying, but this really happened. It didn't just happen in mythology. It actually happened in a place under Pontius Pilate, if that makes sense. So there were elements in these things that provide point of contact, and there is conversation going on in a much more pluralistic way. And all of this is going to prove very helpful. And it's particularly strong in that kind of central area. So if you think about the sociology of conversion, there's always a social connection. So most people, and again, sometimes we don't like this phrase, but it is truth, still the truth. Most people belong before they believe. We like to be purists and say that people should believe and then they belong, but very rare is that happen. Tends to be that they have social connections. They start to take more seriously the practices. They ask questions of them as they observe them and so on. So we belong before we believe. There's also the place where we kind of sometimes have doctrinal persuasion, and that's very often what we think of is in the preaching of the gospel, the preaching of the word, and those from a more reformed, non-charismatic point of view, that's what evangelism is all about. It's about doctrinal persuasion. Our way of seeing the world and of the framework of things that we put in place to teach us how to act is more satisfying and more consistent than yours. And it's not that people don't get saved that way, but again, it's actually much harder work. There is one that we like, because I come from a charismatic stream as well. The third element is actually where you have a mystic or supernatural encounter. Some years ago now, my father was asked to give what's called the Henry Martin Lecture, which is a very academic lecture on missions. It takes place every year, and he was invited to deliver it with a paper and so on. So he did a load of research and presented a paper that didn't go down super well with everybody, because what he showed is whenever the gospel had broken into a new territory, you always found signs accompanying. Just like you do with the story of the day of Pentecost, there is a sign. And of course, that's the story of Paul's conversion. If we take Paul, if I think of it like this, and Paul is the exception, not the norm, because he kind of goes, he works with his way backwards. He has the supernatural encounter. He then goes off on his own, reads the texts that are available about the life of Jesus, applies it to his knowledge of the Old Testament and Scripture as he prays around it and so on. And then eventually he goes back and joins the community in the church and starts to slowly make relationships. Because for most people, this is more the reality. The big thing is social connection. But some people are introduced into that social connection very often by maybe someone's prayed for them. There might be a mystic state, supernatural type dynamic that brings them in. It may not take them the whole way. And in fact, that's very often the case with the supernatural, is it opens a door, but it doesn't take people through the door. So perhaps why we find, as my father's research showed, that there were no new territories opened up for the gospel you don't find signs accompanying. The signs accompanying don't necessarily make full converts, though, disciples. And for that, there's then all of the social connections come into play. And in that context, we learn the doctrinal things. And we're learning doctrine right the way through our lives. Our understanding of our faith is growing. So I just wanted to kind of spell that out to kind of help see how the context is, the social connection in the context is one that's easy to ignore, but in actual fact is very real and very concrete. This is, I put her up because she's well known. So there you go. There's Mary Beard, who alongside with those other guys that I've named there, North and Price, I don't know what their first names are, Beard, North and Price, wrote this 2-volume source book, Religions of Rome. And this is quote is from there. After Paul, there seems to be no organized or systematic program of attracting new believers. So that's a kind of statement, and it's kind of, so we're not quite sure how come the church keeps growing. We don't know of any activity. I put down here, critiqued by sociologist Rodney Stark, who is the author among many of the book I just held up. One of the conclusions he makes in here, which is shocking, but to me makes sense, is that when you actually look at the growth of the church and you look at the factors that really, really seem to mark out where it goes, Paul's preaching made very little difference to the spread of the gospel. Now that seems shocking. The point he then makes, which I think though is the correct one, is that Paul's contribution was theological and organizational. That it turns out that what Mary Berry's baking a cake, Mary Beard missed, was that most of the conversion is happening through the communities that are involving and discussion and talking to folks. And occasionally within that, there are miracles happening. Occasionally within that, there are conversations about doctrine and the way we see the world. And in actual fact, most of the story we told last week, I wasn't explicit about it, but if you stop back and think about it, what we found is, Andrew was going to communities of people who were already there. And he was helping them kind of form themselves into a body. And that little body, as they start to meet together and they have friends and connections and they start asking others, was part of the way in which the church is already growing. So the job of the apostles is less about breaking totally new territory here. Although Paul does try, right towards the end of his ministry, he is in totally virgin areas, as we'll see. And Andrew, as he spread further and further afield, he will be presumably trying to sow into areas that are tough and there aren't connections there already. There's not already an embryonic group and a community. But where things really kind of are growing strongly is because it's not all down to one individual, the superstar who comes in. Because from a correlation point of view, you can show that actually there are things happening in the towns around that Paul never gets to. And we don't know of other apostles that get there, but we do know that there are individuals who get there. When Peter gets to Rome, there are already Christians there, although they don't understand fully their faith. They just perhaps responded on the day of Pentecost. But it was the spreading of that communities of folks who are responding to Jesus from out of their Judaism, but a Judaism that is already in relationship with the Gentiles around them, trying to work out what it means to be Jewish in a Gentile context, having those kind of conversations. They become that social core, which means even when we're not aware of the names of the people like the Paul who are turning up there is growth going on. which explains what Mary Beard can't see. So as I say, it can sometimes feel, because historically the claim has been, even by non-believers, that it must be the reputation that Christianity had for the supernatural. Now, I'm not saying it's not, because I think they did have a reputation for it. But what I'm saying is, actually, if you just look at the social kind of groups there, what you find is that the church continues to grow organically in those areas. So there is as I say, there was a harvest, there was a field to harvest, and then there's a fields to sow brand new seeds into. The brand new seeds will take longer to come to fruition. But actually when they do, there is a continuously growing healthy orchard already in the Central Asian area. Is that making sense? So that's a kind of bit of theory. Quote from the book I've just been holding up. Within 20 years of the crucifixion, Christianity has transformed from a faith based in rural Galilee into an urban movement reaching far beyond Palestine. In the beginning, it was borne by nameless itinerant preachers and by rank-and-file Christians who shared their faith with relatives and friends. Soon they were joined by the professional missionaries such as Paul. And actually that statement he makes there is not inconsistent with what we saw last week. The folks of people like Andrew going and visiting the places where people came from who were there on the day of Pentecost. So they start to organisationally do something into the church. It's been multiple times, it's been estimated, and the estimates range between 10 and 15% of the entire Roman Empire was actually made up of people who have a connection with Judaism, who could claim to be Jews. Now that is an enormous figure if you stop and think of it. 10 to 15%. That little map that I found that shows the purple areas where we've been looking at. Let me make it a bit bigger. Hang on, let's go full screen. So those purple areas are the historic ones that were there one AD or 1 CE, as they put it there. The blue areas are later Roman period, and then the red areas are possible. This community, which is Paul talks about the Jew first and then the Greek. Even Paul, who calls himself as recognizes his call to the Gentiles, he does his mission by going first into the Jewish communities to help establish the sense of there being a worshipping community, because that worshipping community is so fundamental to long-term growth. It's how people normally get converted. If you look at it this way, every year the Lord makes billions of gallons of wine the normal, natural, slow way. And at one point in history in the Gospels, he turns 12 jars of water into wine in an instant. Because every year water falls and gets turned into wine through the natural processes. There are very often, that's the way God seems to work. The miracles really are miracles. They are often the icing on the cake rather than the cake. There's a dynamic involved in the process. So, and of that, 90% actually of that Jewish population lived in the city areas, not surprisingly. And that itself, because as they adopted the doctrinal basis and the doctrinal meaning of Christianity, impacted the social nature of the Roman Empire and transformed it. It's what there are well documented histories through the hundreds of years that follow the century that we're looking at, of how the gladiator fights stopped, how slavery starts to fall into disrepute, and so on. Because actually that's how the doctrinal side, as they absorb them through the community and start to explore them, express them, it grows and righteously kind of uplifts the whole community. So we live in quite interesting times, because in many ways we face going the opposite way at the moment. So perhaps there are lessons to learn from this century about how we understand and do our faith. So the Jewish diaspora was key. So these communities, alongside growing cities with extensive and speedy and relatively safe trade routes, are key to the spread of the gospel, as were the large cities and port cities. Sorry, that's not a very slightly odd that I've kind of doubled things up there. So I'm just going to throw a few maps up before we get going on telling the story today. So actually there are only 31, this is why the red 31 is in the bottom. There are only 31 Roman cities at 100 AD which have a population of greater than 30,000. So they're actually, and it was actually looking at these cities that Rodney Stark is able to make some of his regression analyses and test some theories about how the gospel spreads. Jerusalem's not one of them, that's why I put it in red, because of course Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD. But there are those 31 cities. If you look at the Hellenized cities, you can see they're all in this area. Rome is the only, now Rome is not a Hellenized city, but it has a Hellenized Jewish community in it. What we mean by Hellenized city is quite considerable numbers of Jews in the city. And we notice that 10 to 15% of the entire Roman Empire, so actually in some of these cities is about 30% or so. It's a much higher level. So these are where there are large Jewish communities with that complete stretch of from those who are very religiously observant and quite nervous of outsiders, those who are friendly with outsiders but kind of keep a respectful distance, those who have intermarried and therefore they're a bit confused and not quite sure whether they're in the community or out of the community, those who have just kind of gone the whole way but try to stay culturally connected and so on. All of those things are happening in these cities, which we're recognizing. Cybele and Isis, which are two really highly developed kind of henotheistic paganism that's on its way to monotheism, trying to get there. You can see, just by looking at them, you can see there's a certain level of quite a lot of crossover, which is not surprising. There are 18 of them, so less cities, but you can see where there are large Jewish communities, there's been a lot going on there. And these are where we find large active churches in 100 and 180 AD. Now the thing to flag here, so what have I put there? There are. If you go back over those, there are only two major cities in the Roman world where the church has grown fast enough to lead solid empirical evidence of its presence by 180 AD. But when we're looking at these figures, we're looking at where you can prove a large, vibrant community or a church there. The lack of the absence of that proof is not proof of absence. It's just we're working with the places where you go and you find Christian terms on gravestones, in legal documents. You find quotes from the Bible being used in public oratory and so on, things like that. So these are really kind of concrete. But when you kind of look at all of those things, there are only two cities which may have had a church, but we're just too small to see. When we look at those major ones that are neither Hellenized nor have any form of almost monotheistic paganism. So you can see that those two things have been kind of like a precursor. They have softened up the ground. They've kind of cleared away the stones. They've turned it over to make it receptive. And as I say, he does a regression analysis so you can compare one thing against another. And actually kind of shows that Hellenistic influence and kind of paganism that's moving towards monotheism are far more important than city size or distance from Jerusalem or trade routes. So the most important factors, the thing that's made the territory open, is this process which probably was initiated by God with the various waves of exile that prophesied and happened through the end of the Old Testament in the intertestamental period. So in many ways, this is just showing a really strong correlation between the Jewish diaspora, their influence on the pagan world around them, and then subsequent Christian conversion. So I spent rather a long time doing that. My apologies. But it's not the whole story. Just in case you were wondering, that little timeline along the bottom. Let me put myself back on the screen. And what we'll do is go back to that one. Okay. Oh, I'm in the way. Okay, I have to get rid of myself. Hang on. I'll talk that little timeline on the bottom so you can see it all. Pentecost was obvious, 33 AD. The temple is going to get destroyed next week, in 70 AD. That line at 100 AD is because within 5 years, just a little bit either side of 100 AD, and we know that lions finally went extinct in Europe. So just a big R. And the last lions were killed in the Balkan areas of Europe at that point. So no indigenous lions left in Europe in 100 AD. 44. That was the death of Herod Agrippa. That was we're going to be, and this is the period we're looking at today is 44. We're going to cover 49. So we'll mark along that as we go through over this week and next week. So we showed this quote last time. Into the universal earth has gone out their sound, i.e. whom have the nations believed. So just reminding ourselves. Oh, I forgot that. I wanted that to appear. The map at the top shows the Greek Empire. You can see, if I add there the Roman Empire, can you see doesn't stretch as far west. Sorry, as far east. It's really what I wanted to highlight. It pushes further to the north. It obviously takes over Britain, which is actually conquered during last week, but I didn't mention it, by Claudius. There are relationships between Britain and Rome up until Claudius, but it's Claudius who finally conquers it. And similarly, there are relationships, and there will be Romans and Roman roads that extend into the old Greek Empire, although technically the Roman Empire doesn't get as far east. But between the two of them, you can see the kind of the spread of those kind of areas, which have been turned over. The ground has been turned over for the gospel. So I make it rather messy by putting them all together on there. You'll notice down at the bottom there's some folks that are outside of the remit of the Roman Empire, but which we do hear about in the Bible, and we hear about in the journeys of people like Thomas, Bartholomew, and Andrew, as we're going to go on through them. And that's fine. These areas, there was still access into most of the way via the old Greek Empire, but we're even going to see things pushing outside of the old Greek Empire too. So yeah, we'll move on from there. This is the one that in the end where Tertullian is saying today, and where I've kind of covered them and given them a tint. There are people from all of these regions that now hear the gospel in 180. So back to the story. Well, that was quite a long introduction. So the church is spreading further afield, and there are more and more believers who are taking on leadership roles and so on. The importance of Matthew's written reports is going to be growing. But there's also that need now for Jesus' teaching in a form that can be accessed by non-Jews or people who aren't Jewish speakers. In the Jewish diaspora, there is a very large percentage, it varies from town to town, but a very large percentage don't speak a word of